On the night of October 31, 1999, EgyptAir Flight 990 plunged into the Atlantic Ocean about 60 miles south of Nantucket Island. All 217 people on board were killed. What followed was one of the most contentious aviation investigations in history, one that drove a wedge between two nations and left a question that has never been fully resolved. The official American conclusion pointed to deliberate action by the relief first officer, Gamal al-Batouti. Egypt rejected that finding completely, and to this day, the two sides have never agreed. But what if the Americans were wrong? Flight 990 departed JFK at 1:19 in the morning, bound for Cairo. About 33 minutes after takeoff, the captain left the flight deck for a rest break. Al-Batouti was left in control. What happened next unfolded in seconds. At 1:48 in the morning, al-Batouti began repeating a phrase in Arabic, "Tawakkalt ala Allah," I put my trust in God. The autopilot disconnected. The flight data recorder showed the elevators moving in a split configuration. The nose pitched down. The plane entered a steep dive. The captain returned to the flight deck. His voice is heard saying, "Pull with me. Pull with me." The data shows he was pulling back on his column while the other column was being pushed forward. Then, both engines were shut down. The aircraft hit the water at approximately 1:50 in the morning. There were no survivors. The NTSB concluded the most probable cause was the intentional actions of al-Batouti. Their reasoning rested on the timing of the autopilot disconnection, the split elevator inputs, the engine shutdown, the repeated religious phrase, and reports that al-Batouti had been reprimanded over allegations of sexual misconduct just days before the flight. Egypt's Civil Aviation Authority rejected every part of this. They argued the evidence pointed to a mechanical failure in the elevator control system. They noted the split elevator movement could indicate a malfunction rather than deliberate pilot input. They argued al-Batouti's phrase was a common expression used by Egyptian Muslims in moments of stress, not a suicide declaration. They pointed out no suicide note was ever found, no history of mental illness, and a family he was close to. So what if it wasn't al-Batouti? The mechanical theory centers on the elevator system. The Boeing 767 uses a dual elevator system, and there are documented cases where a malfunction can cause an elevator split. The NTSB acknowledged the split condition in the data, but argued it was caused by opposing pilot inputs. Egypt's investigators argued the split appeared before any clear evidence of opposing inputs, suggesting the mechanical failure came first. This is genuinely difficult to resolve. The flight data recorder captures position and movement, but doesn't always tell you what caused what. Boeing supported the NTSB's interpretation, but Boeing had an obvious interest in the outcome. A finding of mechanical failure on a widely used aircraft would have been enormously costly. The engine shutdown remains the hardest piece of evidence for the mechanical theory to account for. Engines don't turn themselves off in cruise flight. Shutting down both requires a deliberate sequence of actions. It's possible al-Batouti shut them down in a misguided response to what he believed was a malfunction, but most aviation analysts don't find that convincing. Another angle is the human factors question. Could al-Batouti have suffered a sudden medical emergency that caused him to slump forward on the controls? This has happened in aviation. The problem is the cockpit voice recorder. He was speaking clearly and repeatedly. A person incapacitated by a cardiac event or stroke severe enough to push a column forward and shut down both engines would not typically be speaking calmly. A more nuanced version asks whether al-Batouti experienced a sudden psychological episode, not a premeditated decision, but something that overtook him in that cockpit in ways even he may not have understood. This is almost impossible to investigate after the fact. We know he was 59, facing the end of his career, reportedly humiliated by a senior official, alone on the flight deck over the dark Atlantic in the middle of the night. Whether any of that matters, we cannot say. There is also the question of whether the investigation itself was compromised. Egyptian officials felt the Americans had decided on their conclusion early and were building a case to support it. They felt al-Batouti's phrase was being interpreted through a cultural lens that didn't understand its significance, and they felt the motive narrative was being used to paint a picture of a troubled man without sufficient evidence. Confirmation bias is a real problem in accident investigations. The NTSB is one of the best investigation bodies in the world, but they are not immune to it. In this case, the cultural and political dimensions were enormous. A finding of undetermined cause would have been defensible. The NTSB chose not to go that route. To be fair, the evidence against al-Batouti is substantial. The timing of the autopilot disconnection, the engine shutdown, which is very hard to explain as anything other than deliberate. The captain's desperate plea suggesting he believed someone was actively working against him. If you take all of that together, the NTSB's conclusion is not unreasonable. It may even be the most likely single explanation, but most likely is not the same as certain. And in a case with consequences this significant for the families, for two countries, for the reputation of a man who cannot defend himself, that difference matters enormously. EgyptAir Flight 990 went into the Atlantic on Halloween night in 1999 and killed 217 people. The Americans said a pilot did it deliberately. The Egyptians said a machine failed. Neither side ever fully proved their case. The wreckage lies in water too deep to fully recover. The two men on that flight deck are gone. The uncomfortable truth is that we may never know exactly what happened. The data tells us what the aircraft did. It does not tell us with the certainty we would need why. And in the gap between what we know and what we can prove, the real story of Flight 990 may be permanently lost. The question Egypt asked was a legitimate one. The possibility that something else went wrong on that aircraft was never fully closed. It was answered with a probability, not a proof. And for 217 people and the families they left behind, a probability was never going to be enough.